Photoshop Parametric Filters offer fully customizable and interactive effects you can apply to any layer. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this video, I will show you how to create these dynamic user control filters using Adobe Substance Designer. This video is part of my new advanced Photoshop tutorial series where you will learn advanced Photoshop techniques, stuff you probably won't find anywhere else. So make sure you check out the new advanced tutorial playlist. The link is below in the description. So what are we doing in this video? Two things. First, we will create a basic parametric filter to show you the required components and introduce Adobe Substance Designer. Then, we will create a more comprehensive filter showing you some common pitfalls and solutions. Before we start, let's briefly discuss what Adobe Substance Designer is and how it works. Adobe Substance Designer is an application that allows you to create dynamic adjustable textures and materials for 3D models, not just static images. It uses a node-based editing system, not layers, where each node represents an effect or adjustment. By connecting these nodes, you can intuitively build complex materials. What makes Substance Designer special is that it creates parametric materials. This means you're saving the entire process used to create the image, not just the final result. This non-destructive workflow offers incredible flexibility. Best of all, you can use this same technology to create parametric filters to use in Photoshop. If you've never used them before, then I recommend watching my latest video where I showed how to use the embroidery filter to create realistic patches. It'll give you a good idea to what they're all about. Let me now show you how to create your first Photoshop parametric filter using Adobe Substance Designer. Start by opening Designer from your Creative Cloud app. You may require an upgrade to your subscription, but you can always follow along with the free trial. This is the Adobe Substance Designer welcome screen. From here, you can click on New Substance Graph. Then, you can choose one of the templates to get started. In this first example, I'll select Empty and click OK. This is the interface in Adobe Substance Designer. To ensure we're all looking at the same thing, I'll click on Windows and choose Reset Layout and press Yes. This interface can be a lot to take in, but no worries, you only need to remember a few key areas to get started. First, on the top left, you will see the Explorer panel, where you will store everything related to your project. On the bottom left, you will see the library, which contains the nodes and resources you will use to build your filter. On the right, you will see the Properties panel. Much like Photoshop, it is a contextual panel, which means the content changes based on the selected object. On the bottom, you will see the 3D and 2D views, allowing you to visualize the filter you create in real time. For the most part, when creating Photoshop parametric filters, you will primarily focus on the 2D view. The most important part of the Substance Designer interface is the graph view, here in the center. This workspace will contain all the nodes that will create your filter. Let's start by creating a simple filter to see how it all works. First, we must create a node that grabs the image information from your Photoshop layer. To do so, press the spacebar or the tab key to enable the search bar over the graph. I like using the spacebar. By the way, this is the content you'll primarily find in the library panel, but it's much easier to find what you're looking for in the search feature. Now, just start typing the word input. In Designer, we'll populate the list with matching results. Click on Input Color when it appears. This node has 4 channels: red, green, blue, and alpha, perfect from importing a color layer from Photoshop. If the input node is where information enters our graph, we'll also need an output node to serve as the exit point for that information. To add an output mode, tap on the spacebar and search for Output. Here it is. Simply click on it to add it to your graph. From the graph view, you can drag and move your nodes around. You can zoom into the graph by scrolling on the mouse wheel, and pan by holding down the mouse wheel button and dragging. If you get lost and can't find your way back, tap the F key to fit your nodes on screen. We now have 2 nodes in this graph: a starting point, which will take the image information from the layer, and an ending point, which will put it back after we apply the filter. Now we just need the middle, the effect our filter will create. To add the effect, tap the spacebar and search for Blur. Click on this blurred node Next, we need to connect these nodes together so that they work as a unit. To start, click on the orange output circle in the input node. This orange color represents a colored node. And then, hover over to the blurred node. No need to hold down the mouse button, just click on the orange and gray input circle on the blurred node. The half-fill circle means you can connect either a color or grayscale node. Then click on the blurred node's output orange circle and connect it to the output node's input circle. Now in this graph, we have a node that takes an image from Photoshop, it applies a blur, and sends it back. But unfortunately, we cannot see the effect, so let's import a preview image. Go into the Explorer panel and right-click on the package. That's the one with the box icon, and from Import, choose Bitmap. Then select any image from your computer. Designer will then create a new folder called Resources that will contain your imported image. Now simply drag it into the input node to see a preview of the filter you just created. Keep in mind that this image is only for preview purposes. It will not export to the Photoshop parametric filter. Let's now talk about the 2D view window. When you double-click on a node, the 2D view window will display the contents of that node. In this case, it shows the input preview. But look at the node. It has two icons on the top left, a properties icon and the 2D view icon. This means that the properties panel is currently displaying this node's specific properties, and that the 2D view window is also displaying this node's preview. But if you click once on a node instead of double-clicking, the properties panel will change to the selected node, leaving behind the preview. Now, the properties panel corresponds to the blurred node and the preview remains with the input node. And if you hold the Alt key and click once, the 2D view will change to the selected node. Again, notice the icons on the top left of the node to help you understand what's displayed on these panels. For this project, I recommend keeping the output on the 2D view and the properties on the blurred node. In the properties panel, from the specific parameters section, you can now control the amount of the blur by dragging the intensity slider. And the 2D view reflects those changes. If I were to export this package now and import it to Photoshop, it will apply this effect without any control for the blur amount. And that wouldn't make a good filter. To give control over the parameters in Photoshop, click on the flyout menu and choose Expose as New Graph Input. This will make it so that this slider appears in Photoshop. Also keep in mind that not all controls are available in Photoshop, but there's no problem in this case and most controls do show up. From the Expose Parameter window, you will see the options for the control that will be displayed in Photoshop. The identifier is a backend name that is not relevant to this video. The most important one here is the label, which is the name of the slider the user will see in Photoshop. Simply calling it intensity could be confusing, especially if you have other sliders controlling some other type of intensity. So in this case, I will call it blur amount. There's no need to make any other changes, just press OK. Next, let's work with the graph and apply the final settings. Double-click anywhere on the graph. Notice that the properties icon no longer appears over any of the nodes. From the Properties panel, go into the Attributes tab and give the identifier a name. This is the name of the graph that you're currently working on. You can also see it in the Explorer panel, currently called Substance_Graph. I'll call it PTC_blur. No spaces are allowed here. Then add a label. Again, I'll call it PTC blur, but this time with a space. Under Type, choose Filter. But since we have an input node, this is not necessary, but I like to add it anyway. You can then click on this folder to import an image that will become the icon for this filter in Photoshop. If you decide to add one, make sure you use an image with a 1:1 ratio, a square. If you don't have an image, no worries. Leave it blank and one will be generated for you automatically, which is what I will do. Now that we're done with our filter, we need to save the package. This is a Substance Designer file. Simply press Ctrl S on Windows, Command S on the Mac to save. Notice that the file name here is the same as the identifier, PTC_blur. And all I need to do is click Save. Next, export the graph to use it as a filter in Photoshop. To do so, click on the package, which now reads PTC_blur. Then click on this icon with the up arrow. From here, choose Publish SPSAR, which is a compiled substance source file that contains a material's parameters and exposed settings. SPSAR files are not editable, but they expose controls for the effects they create and they will not change the structure of the content. These files could be read by many 3D applications and Photoshop. From this window, click the 3-dot icon, then name the file. By the way, the name that you use here will appear under the filter in the parametric filter list in Photoshop. I'll call it PTC Blur, and I'll put an X on it so you can see where this name will appear. Then click Save, and from here, click Publish. Now you can open the Photoshop beta, and from the filter menu, choose Parametric Filters. From this panel, click on the plus icon on the bottom right, and open the SPSAR file you just saved. Now under the section called Your Filters, you will see your brand new parametric filter. There it is, you can see the X, and if you uploaded an image, you will see it on here, but in this case, I have the auto-generated image. When you click on the filter, Photoshop will apply it. And notice here we have the icon, and you can see the letter X we added on the name. Now under Properties, you will see the blur amount. This is a custom label we added for the intensity of the blur. By the way, one of my favorite features about parametric filters is that in most cases, if the slider reaches the end, you can release, and that value will now become the center. And you then can continue dragging to increase the value even more, in this case adding more blur. Now let's create a more complex parametric filter to explore additional features, common pitfalls, and their solutions. Our goal is to create a filter that creates a retro photo effect with customizable dust, stains, and scratches. But before we start, make sure you hit like now and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Again, we'll start from scratch. Create a new substance graph. Choose the empty template and name it PTC Retro. Press OK. Then click on the package from the Explorer panel and press Ctrl S to save the SPS file. From this window, simply click the Save button. Now, you can simply press Ctrl S as you work to save and not lose any progress. We'll start by creating input and output nodes. Hold the spacebar and search for them. Input color and output. I'll move the output to the side and zoom out by scrolling down with the mouse wheel. Remember, you can pan by holding down the mouse wheel while dragging. First, let's import an image to preview our filter. Go into the Explorer panel, right-click on the package, that's the one with the box icon, and from Import, choose Bitmap. Then select any image you like. I'll use the same one from the previous example. Substance Designer will then create a new resources folder containing the imported image. And now simply drag it into the input node. Remember that this image is only for preview purposes. It will not export to the Photoshop parametric filter. Now let's add a few nodes that will help create the look of a retro photo. First, let's add a node that blurs the image. We don't want the photo looking too sharp. To do so, we'll create a Blur HQ color node. Of course, you can hold the spacebar and search for it, but you can also find it in the library panel under Filters, Blurs. Here it is, Blur HQ color, and drag it onto the graph. Make sure you take some time to explore the library panel. It's a great way to discover nodes and spark ideas for your filters. Next, connect the input node to the blurred node. Notice the orange connectors? This means that they are color nodes. You will see why this is important later on. And keep an eye out on the 2D window. I won't reference it much, but I will always look there to see how the settings we apply affect the image. Now set the intensity to 0.25. This will be the default blur setting. And I will expose this setting by choosing Expose as new graph input from the flyout menu. This will make it an editable adjustment in Photoshop. I'll name the label Blur Intensity. Next, let's create a node that will help us control the color and saturation of the image. Hold the spacebar and search for HSL node. This node is very similar to the hue and saturation adjustment in Photoshop. And then you can connect the blurred node to it. Now, set the hue to 0.52, the saturation to 0.4, and leave the lightness at default. Then expose each of these controls. In this case, there is no need to change the label, the default names will work just fine. Let's now add a few more effects. Hold the spacebar and look for the blue noise fast node. This node adds a simple noise pattern that we can use to simulate grain on the photo. Notice that this node does not have an input, only an output, so you cannot connect our working image to it. Also, the output is grayscale, indicated by the gray circle. If you try connecting this node to a color node, it wouldn't be compatible and it wouldn't work. That's what this red dashed line indicates. So we have two problems to solve here. First, let's work on solving the grayscale problem. We need to convert this grayscale node to a colored node to ensure compatibility with other nodes in this project. Tap on the spacebar and look for the RGBA merge node. Notice that this node has grayscale inputs, these are the dots in gray, and the color output, the dot in orange. All you need to do is connect the noises node's output to the three channels, red, green, and blue. Let's now work with the alpha channel. You can think of it as a layer mask in Photoshop. Black conceals, white reveals, and different levels of gray create varying levels of transparency. In this case, we want a pure white alpha channel to reveal the entire effect. To do so, tap on the spacebar and search for the uniform color node. From the Properties panel, set it to grayscale and make it 100% white by dragging the luminosity slider to 255. If you need to, move the nodes around to clean up your graph. I'll drag a selection over these two nodes and move them up. And I'll place the uniform color node below them. Then connect the uniform color node to the alpha channel. And after you do all this, the noise can now be connected to a color node. Now we need to solve the second problem, which is blending the noise node to the effect we have created so far. For that, we will use a blend node. Tap on the spacebar and it's right here. You don't even need to search for it. You can think of this node as layers in Photoshop. It will give you the option to add a background and a foreground, and you can use opacity or blending modes to blend them together. Connect the HSL node to the background and the RGBA merge node to the foreground. Then set the opacity to 0.25. And from the blending mode dropdown, scroll down and choose soft light. Expose the opacity and label it grain opacity. Let's now continue adding more effects. Tap on the spacebar and search for Grunge Rust Fine. This will be the node that helps us add stains to our image. Notice that we have the same grayscale issue as before, but we will solve it in a different way. But before we do that, change both the balance and contrast to 0.25. Then expose these settings. Call the balance Grunge Amount and the contrast Grunge Contrast. Now search for a node called Gradient Map. This works just like a gradient map in Photoshop. It recolors the image to the colors on a gradient based on its brightness. Notice that the input is grayscale and the output is color, so we will not need the RGBA merge node. Connect the Grunge Rust node to the gradient map and set the brighter colors to a bright red. Now the areas in the grunge effect that were white are now red and the black areas remain black. Unfortunately, this node does not allow you to expose these settings to Photoshop, so we will need to use a hack to get it to work. Create another HSL node, connect the gradient map to it, and you can use the hue and saturation controls to adjust the color and saturation. Make the color brown and expose these settings. Call the hue label Grunge Color and the saturation label Grunge Saturation. Now we'll use another blend node to merge these together. Connect the previous blend node to the background input and the HSL node to the foreground. Then set the blending mode to screen to make black invisible and only keep the brown grunge effect. Then expose the opacity and call the label Grunge Opacity. Next, I'll create more space to work with. I'll zoom out by scrolling down on the mouse wheel. Then I'll select these nodes and move them to the right. I think I need more space in this, so I'll pan by holding the mouse wheel and dragging. Then I'll move the output node further to the right. And I'll tap the F key to frame everything on screen. Let's now add one final effect. tap the spacebar and search for Grunge Scratches Fine. This is another one of those nodes that we will need to convert to color, and we will use the RGBA merge node like we did earlier. Add the Grunge Scratches node to the 3 RGB inputs, and you can connect the previous white uniform color node to the alpha input. No need to create a new one. Now create another blend node to merge these together. Connect the previous blend node to the background input, and the RGBA merge node to the foreground. Then set the blending mode to soft light. Now click on the Grunge and Scratches node to access the properties. And set the balance to 0.5, the contrast to 0.3, the scratch amount to 0.3, sharpen to 3, and the value bias to 0.4. I know that this effect is difficult to see, so I'll zoom in by hovering over the 2D view and scrolling up on the mouse wheel. You can now see the black and white scratches on the image. Now, press the F key to go back and see the entire image. Next, expose all these settings. Call the balance Scratch Balance, and the contrast Scratch Contrast. Change this one to Scratch Amount. Add the word Scratch to Sharpen Intensity. And call this last one White Scratch Intensity. Now you can connect the blend node to the output, and we have our parametric filter ready to export. But before we do that, I want to show you one thing that can be very helpful in your projects. Double-click anywhere on the graph, then expand the input parameters. This is where you will find the settings you've just exposed. From here, you can change your order. Just hover over to the left side, and when you see the 4-sided arrow, drag the setting up or down. In this case, I'll drag the grunge opacity above the grunge color. You can also expand the control and rename the label or adjust the default setting. Now we're ready to export this parametric filter into Photoshop. Click on the package to activate it, and then click the export icon and choose Publish SPSAR. From this window, click on the 3-dot icon and give the filter a name. Again, this is the name that will appear in Photoshop as the filter name. I'll call it PTC Retro and save it. Then click Publish. Now in the Photoshop beta, go to Filter, Parametric Filters. From here, click on the white plus icon and find the SPSAR file we just saved. This is the filter here. When you click on it, Photoshop will apply the effect we just created. All the controls are here, and you can adjust them to create an effect that works for your image. By the way, I should point out that with this filter, you can set the hue to 0 and the saturation to 0.5 to bring back the original colors of the image. And also, here are 2 tips I think you should know. First, after you create an effect that works for your image, make sure you save it by clicking on this plus icon, give it a name. That way you can reapply that effect to any of your photos. Your new preset will appear under this dropdown and you can click on it to apply it. Also, you can change the resolution to Ultra to get better results. Now let me show you how to delete your custom parametric filters. First, go into Filter, choose Parametric Filters. From the list, if you click on one of the filters, it will apply it. But instead, if you go into Filter and choose Parametric Filters, then hold the Control key on Windows, that's the Command key on the Mac, and click, you will now see a trash icon here, and the filter will have a blue outline around it. All you need to do now is click on the trash icon and the filter will be deleted, and it will also delete the first one we created earlier by holding Control, clicking on it, and then clicking on the trash icon. And if you made it this far, like now and subscribe. I'm Jesus Ramirez. Thank you for watching.